Hello. If you're watching this video, you probably already know what it's about, but just in case you don't, I will explain it to you. I had an artificial intelligence program on my computer write a story based upon you inputted things like it's based upon thousands of different fantasy stories before it, but it's completely original and unique and completely written by artificial intelligence, so it probably doesn't make sense at some points, but that's to be expected. Robots are dumb. This project probably took over 8 hours over the course of 4 days. That's 2 hours no, it was more than 2 hours a day. I don't know, it was a lot of hours. Okay, it was like 3 hours a day for like 4 days. I've been making this project. So, without further ado, let me tell you the tale of Brandon. Brandon, our Brandon, a ranger living in the kingdom of Smeal. Brandon has a hunting bow and a quiver of arrows. Brandon spots a deer and is ready to finish his hunt, when suddenly, Brandon hears a voice behind Brandon. "Hey, I'm here," a man says as he walks up to Brandon. He is dressed in leather armor, with a long sword strapped across his back. "I heard about what happened out there," Brandon said. "Yeah, it was pretty bad," the man said. "Follow me," Brandon said. "All right then, let's go find somewhere to stay." The man follows Brandon into the forest. The pair of them travel through the night until eventually Brandon comes across a small clearing surrounded by trees. "What is the clearing?" the man asked. "It looks like a cave, but we don't know if it is safe to enter yet," Brandon replied. "Well, we can wait here while Brandon heads inside and checks things out," the man said to Brandon. Brandon nodded and began walking towards the entrance of the cave. As Brandon walked deeper into the cave, Brandon noticed that it doesn't appear to be very large. It seems more like a hole in the ground than anything else. As Brandon got closer, Brandon saw several stone pillars rising from the floor of the cave. Brandon slowly moved forward towards the pillars. As Brandon did so, Brandon started hearing strange noises coming from within them. They sounded like they're coming from inside a human mind, or at least something similar to one. With a loud thud, Brandon kicked the pillar, causing it to fall off its support. Brandon ran over to where the pillar once stood and examined it. There is now a gap between Brandon and the pillars, which means that Brandon can no longer see what lies beyond them. Brandon carefully examined the pillar that fell off its support. It appears to be made of wood, though it has been carved out and modified into a humanoid shape. The creature seems to be wearing some sort of armor, though it isn't particularly effective against Brandon's blade. Brandon continued looking around the cave and soon came across another doorway leading further into the cave. "There must be some sort of way out of this place," Brandon thought to Brandon as approaching the door. "Maybe we should just open it up and explore the place," a man suggested. "Who are you?" Brandon asked. "My name is Kevin, and I am a member of the Order of the White Rose." "Follow me," Brandon stated in a matter-of-fact, gravelly-sounding voice. Kevin nods his head and follows Brandon. Brandon entered the next room and immediately felt very uncomfortable. This room seems to be filled with candles, some of which seem to be lit. There is also a table covered with various items, including books on magic, alchemy, and other subjects. Brandon searched the room and found nothing useful. Brandon then turned back to Kevin. "I'm sorry about all this," but I really need to rest now." "No worries. It's not like we haven't done this before," Brandon replies. After the man fell asleep, Brandon continued onward. The next room looks exactly the same as the last, except there are torches there instead of candles. Brandon don't see any books or other subjects on the table either. Brandon searched the room again and found nothing else of interest. Brandon turned back to Kevin. Brandon walked over to a bookcase and tried to pick one up, but Brandon realized that it would take too much effort. Instead, Brandon decided to search the shelves near the top of the room. Brandon found several bottles and jars filled with liquid, most of which is clear. Brandon quickly grabbed the jar and threw it backwards behind himself. The jar hit a nearby evil wizard, knocking him down. Brandon ran over to him and punched him in the face. When the wizard came to, Brandon kicked him until he stopped moving completely. Oh my god. Brandon rushed over to the wizard and pulled out his sword. Brandon slashed the wizard's arm, killing him instantly. Brandon quickly searched the room for anything valuable. Brandon found a few coins, but they aren't worth much. Brandon then noticed something shiny lying on the floor. It's a gold coin. Brandon picked up the gold coin and examined it closely. It had a small symbol engraved on it. Brandon inspected the symbols carefully and found that they were runes, which means that they must be magical in nature. Brandon put the coin in Brandon's pocket and left the room. Brandon entered the forest and began to explore. Brandon soon came across a large tree trunk covered with runes. They looked very complex, probably made by some sort of ancient race. There are also many strange symbols carved into the bark of the tree, which Brandon could only guess are their own language. Brandon slowly read through the runes. They seemed to contain instructions for making a device that would allow Brandon to travel anywhere in the world without having to worry about being lost. However, if Brandon attempted to use the device, it would cause an explosion that would kill Brandon. What is this story? Brandon continued to read through the runes, trying to decipher what they mean. Eventually, Brandon came across a single word written in the runes: temple. Brandon thought about how odd that would be, since there isn't any place called a temple in the world. Brandon headed towards the temple, Brandon heads toward the temple, which seems to be located somewhere deep within the forest. As Brandon approached, Brandon saw a huge stone door covered with vines and leaves. Inside the temple, there's a massive altar with 3 statues of people holding swords at each other. Brandon opened the giant stone door and stepped inside. The room looks exactly as Brandon remembered it from when Brandon was little. What? A long table sits along one wall with several chairs around it. Brandon stood behind the table and raised Brandon's hands. Suddenly, Brandon felt a sharp pain in Brandon's arm. Brandon turned around and saw the evil wizard standing before Brandon. His face twisted into a hateful sneer. He pointed his finger at Brandon and said, "Go!" Brandon quickly ran forward and swung his sword at the wizard. Unfortunately, he dodged out of the way and swung his blade at Brandon. Brandon blocked it with ease. But now Brandon realized that Brandon's got a knife stuck in Brandon's hand. Brandon kicked the wizard so hard that he flew into space. Brandon then proceeded to stab him repeatedly. The day was saved. The end.